June 4th, 1943. A train slows to a halt on a quiet stretch of railroad street in Mexia, Texas. Inside one of the passenger cars, a German soldier grips a pencil with trembling fingers. His name is Unretizia Vera Burkhardt. Hidden beneath his uniform, inside a small notebook never meant to be seen, he writes words that would be considered treason in the Third Reich. The Americans must be lying to us. Outside the window, the night is not dark. It glows. Farmhouses shimmer with electric light. Street lamps stretch into the distance. Shops remain illuminated long past sunset. The land itself seems alive. Lit, powered, awake. For 3 years, these men had been told a different story. That America was weak, decadent, collapsing under its own excess. Yet here, in the heart of Texas, at 10 o'clock at night, there is light everywhere. And that is only the beginning, as 1,850 battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps step off the train, not into prison camps of misery, but into a world of abundance. They unknowingly cross a threshold, not just from freedom into captivity, but from belief into doubt, from certainty into collapse. Because what they are about to witness will not simply defeat them as soldiers, it will dismantle everything they thought they knew about the world, and raise a terrifying question. What if the enemy is not weaker, but infinitely stronger than anything they had ever imagined? The collapse of certainty had not begun in Texas. It had started weeks earlier, beneath the blazing sun of North Africa. On May 13th, 1943, in Tunisia, the war ended for hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers, not with a final stand, but with surrender. General Jürgen von Arnim, successor to Erwin Rommel, laid down his arms alongside an army that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht. These were not raw recruits or broken conscripts. These were veterans, men who had pushed British forces to the brink, fighters who had survived the desert, the heat, the relentless attrition of mechanized war. Now they were prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, a man decorated, respected, hardened by combat. His war, he believed, was over. What he did not yet understand was that a different kind of battle was about to begin, one that would take place not on sand or steel, but inside his mind. The first cracks appeared in Oran, Algeria. Tens of thousands of prisoners waited in makeshift holding camps along the port. Conditions should have been harsh. That was what they expected. That was what they had been told to expect. Instead, they were processed with a level of efficiency that unsettled them. American soldiers moved with calm precision. Identity cards were issued, photographs taken, medical examinations conducted, vaccinations administered, each step executed not chaotically, but systematically. And then came the detail that disturbed them most. The Americans spoke German, fluently. Officers explained Geneva Convention rights clearly and calmly, as though this moment had been anticipated for years. It felt rehearsed, planned, industrial. But nothing compared to the food, white bread, fresh, soft, unimaginable, real coffee. Meat, served not occasionally, but daily, sometimes twice a day. Oberreiter Hans Müller would later write to his mother that the meals in the camp exceeded anything he had eaten during the final months of desert warfare. At first, they believed it was a performance, a show, a carefully staged illusion meant to impress them. But as days passed, the food did not change. It remained abundant, consistent, routine. That was when the realization began to take hold. This was not propaganda. This was normal. And if this was normal, then what kind of nation could sustain it? The answer began to emerge at sea. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were not warships of prestige or grandeur. They were something far more unsettling. They were ordinary, mass-produced cargo vessels. And yet the scale of their production defied comprehension. One ship, they were told, had been built in just over 4 days. 4 days. Even the most loyal among the prisoners dismissed it as absurd. Impossible. Another lie. But the ships kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Each one identical in purpose. Each one evidence of something far more dangerous than military strength. Industrial inevitability. During the 2-week voyage, the prisoners observed quietly. They watched the crew. They watched the routines. And they watched something that would haunt them long after the war. Waste. Food was discarded casually. Half-eaten steaks thrown away, entire loaves of bread tossed aside, milk poured out because it had been left too long. Not as an insult, not as a display, but because it did not matter. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded it with a kind of disbelief that bordered on despair. They did this openly, without thought, because to them, this waste meant nothing. Nothing. In Germany, scarcity defined life. Rations were calculated, measured, fought over. Here, abundance erased the concept of value entirely. The prisoners began to understand something they had never been taught. Wealth was not just what you had. It was what you could afford to lose. And America, it seemed, could afford to lose anything. By the time their ships approached the American coast in early August 1943, the psychological shift had already begun. But nothing could prepare them for what they were about to see. Norfolk Naval Base rose from the horizon like a vision of another world. Miles of docks, dozens of ships, cranes moving constantly, loading, unloading, never stopping. The sheer scale overwhelmed the senses. In a single day, this one port handled more cargo than some of Germany's largest ports could manage in a week. Prisoners counted ships the way soldiers once counted enemy tanks. 47 vessels in motion, simultaneously, and still there was no chaos, no confusion, only motion, orderly, continuous, endless. As they marched from the docks, another detail struck them. Cars, hundreds of them, parked casually outside warehouses and offices, not luxury vehicles, not symbols of elite status, but ordinary cars, owned by workers, dock laborers, men who, in Germany, would never have dreamed of such ownership. The myth was unraveling faster now, not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet, undeniable contradictions. And then came the trains. The moment many would later describe as the point of no return. They expected cattle cars, freight wagons, the kind used to transport troops, livestock, or worse. Instead, they were led into Pullman passenger coaches, soft seats, sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths, silver cutlery. Some prisoners hesitated before boarding, unsure if it was a trick. It wasn't. Hauptmann Radke would later write, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." One American guard even apologized for the air conditioning not functioning properly. Air conditioning, in the middle of summer, for prisoners of war. It was at that moment that something irreversible began to take shape in the minds of these men. Not anger, not resentment, but confusion, because nothing about this matched the world they had been taught to believe in. And as the train pulled away from Norfolk, carrying them deeper into the American interior, they pressed their faces to the windows, watching, trying to make sense of a country that seemed to defy logic itself. A country where even the night refused to be dark. The train moved through Virginia first. Small towns passed by in a blur of light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, each one illuminated, each one alive. Factories operated through the night. Windows glowed with activity. Workers moved in shifts that never seemed to end. There were no blackouts, no enforced darkness, no fear of aerial bombardment shaping daily life. Instead, there was continuity, normalcy. Electricity flowed without interruption, without limitation. To men who had lived under blackout conditions since 1940, it felt almost surreal, like watching a forbidden dream. Oberreiter Müller would later write in disbelief that even the smallest towns they passed possessed more visible electricity than entire districts of Hamburg. He accused a guard of lying. The guard did not argue, he simply shrugged and said, "You'll see." The deeper the train traveled, the more impossible it became to deny. At a railway stop in Roanoke, the prisoners observed workers refueling and servicing the train. What should have taken hours was completed in minutes. Coal loaded mechanically, water pumped with electric systems, lubrication handled with precision tools. No delays, no inefficiencies, no wasted motion. Everything moved with a rhythm that suggested something larger at work. A system not just built for war, but optimized for scale. And the workers themselves, they did not appear burdened. They wore sturdy boots, smoked freely, drank bottled beverages, behaved with a casual confidence that suggested comfort, not struggle. Even their waste carried meaning. Half-smoked cigarettes discarded without hesitation, glass bottles tossed aside without concern. These were not luxuries. They were habits, and habits, more than anything else, reveal truth. By the time the train crossed into Tennessee, something profound had begun to settle in. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. A quiet, creeping awareness that the war they had been fighting might not have been what they believed it to be, and that the enemy they had been taught to underestimate might already have won, without them ever realizing it. The train continued westward, and with every mile, the illusion weakened further, until finally it began to break. The transformation did not come in a single moment of revelation. It came in layers. Each mile west peeled away another piece of certainty, another fragment of belief that had once seemed unshakable. As the train pushed deeper into the American interior, the scale of what they were witnessing expanded beyond anything their minds could easily process. In Tennessee, the landscape shifted. Factories began to dominate the horizon, vast, sprawling complexes that stretched for miles along rivers and rail lines. Their smokestacks rose like monuments, not to destruction, but to production. One facility in particular captured their attention: the Alcoa aluminum plant. It extended along the river for what seemed like an endless distance, its structures glowing with energy, its furnaces operating at a scale that bordered on the incomprehensible. The guards, some talkative, explained casually that the plant consumed more electrical power than entire European cities. 175,000 kilowatts. The number meant little at first, but to the engineers among the prisoners, it was staggering. It was not just the size of the plant. It was what it represented. Aluminum was essential for aircraft. Aircraft meant air superiority, and air superiority meant control of the war itself. The implications settled heavily among them. If one plant could produce at this level, how many others were there? No one answered that question, but the train kept moving. Near Louisville, Kentucky, the prisoners saw something even more unsettling. The Rubbertown complex, a cluster of massive facilities, recently built, rising from what had once been empty land. Synthetic rubber plants, 4 of them, each enormous, each modern, each operating at full capacity. The guards explained that these plants had been constructed in less than 2 years, 18 months. The Germans who understood chemistry, men who had worked in the laboratories of IG Farben, who knew the complexity of synthetic rubber production, felt something close to disbelief. Germany had pioneered the process, but even at its peak, it had never reached this scale. Never this output, never this speed. 800,000 tons annually. The figure circulated quietly among the prisoners. Compared to Germany's best year, barely a fraction of that. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist, stared out the window as the distillation towers passed by, rising like steel skeletons against the sky. He did not speak for a long time, because he already understood. This was not just industrial capacity, this was industrial dominance. The kind that could not be matched, the kind that could not be caught up to. And slowly, without announcement, a realization began to take hold among the most perceptive of the prisoners. The war was no longer a contest. It was an equation, and the numbers did not favor Germany. The train rolled onward, into Ohio, into the industrial heartland. And then, outside Detroit, they saw something that would remain burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. The Willow Run plant. Even before they saw it, they sensed it. The sheer size of the structure was visible from miles away, a factory so vast it seemed unnatural. As the train passed, the prisoners pressed against the windows, straining to take it all in. Inside, visible through massive openings and glass panels, aircraft took shape. Bombers. B-24 Liberators. Dozens of them, at different stages of assembly. Some were bare skeletons, others nearly complete. The line moved continuously, parts flowed, workers moved in coordination, and above it all, a system operated with relentless precision. 1 bomber every 63 minutes. The number passed through the train like a shockwave. 63 minutes, less than the length of a typical German artillery barrage. And in that time, an entire aircraft, complex, powerful, deadly, was assembled. Not handcrafted, not painstakingly built over weeks, but produced, like a commodity, like something ordinary. 42,000 workers, 1.5 million parts per plane. And yet, it worked. It worked with a consistency that defied logic. A Luftwaffe pilot among the prisoners, shot down months earlier, counted aircraft frames as they passed. 17 visible at once. 17. He had flown missions in Africa where entire squadrons consisted of fewer planes, and here they were being produced faster than they could be destroyed. The propaganda he had believed about inferior American aircraft, about rushed construction and poor quality, felt hollow now. Because this was not chaos, it was precision. And it was scale. The combination was devastating. The train continued west, across the Mississippi River, into the vast agricultural expanse of the American Midwest. And here, a different kind of power revealed itself. Not steel, not machinery, but food. In St. Louis, the prisoners crossed the Mississippi on a towering bridge. Below them, barges moved slowly along the river, each one loaded with grain, mountains of it. Grain elevators lined the riverbanks, massive structures capable of storing quantities that dwarfed anything the prisoners had seen in Europe. A farmer's son among them, Unratizia Karl Schmidt, watched in silence. He had grown up working fields in Bavaria. He understood harvests. He understood yield. But this was something else. He tried to calculate it, tried to make sense of the volume, but the numbers refused to settle. One barge alone, he realized, carried enough wheat to feed his entire village for years. Years, and there were dozens of barges, moving constantly, loading, unloading, never stopping. Food here was not scarce. It was industrial. It was produced, transported, and stored with the same efficiency as weapons. And that realization carried a weight that went beyond hunger, because wars were not won by weapons alone. They were won by supply, by endurance, by the ability to feed not just armies but entire nations. And America, it seemed, could do that effortlessly. In Kansas City, the lesson deepened. The train slowed near the stockyards, and the prisoners saw cattle, thousands upon thousands of them, an ocean of livestock stretching as far as the eye could see. The smell of meat processing plants filled the air. It was overwhelming, not just physically, but psychologically, because many of these men had spent months rationing meat to the bare minimum, 200 grams per week if they were lucky. Here, workers ate beef sandwiches during their breaks, casually, without ceremony, without scarcity. One prisoner recalled watching a guard purchase hamburgers for a group of them, 20 sandwiches, paid for with a $1 bill. No hesitation, no calculation, just routine. The bread was white, the meat thick, the portions generous. It was not special. It was not a reward. It was simply food. And that, more than anything, began to dismantle the illusion they had carried across the ocean. Because if a nation could feed its prisoners this way, what could it provide for its own people? And more importantly, what could it provide for its army? By the time the train crossed into Texas, the transformation was well underway. But it had not yet reached its peak. That moment came not in a factory or a field, but in something far more ordinary, something deceptively simple, light. As the train approached Mexia that June night, the prisoners saw it. Not in fragments, not in isolated pockets, but everywhere. Electric light stretching across the landscape like a constellation brought down to earth. Farmhouses illuminated, porches glowing, streetlights marking roads that cut through the darkness. Everywhere they looked, light. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged cities and villages into darkness for years. Even before the war, electrification in rural areas had been limited. Many farms still relied on oil lamps, candles, manual labor. But here, even the most remote homes were connected, powered, alive. It was not a display. It was not staged. It was simply how things were. And for the men stepping off that train, it was the final fracture. The point at which doubt became certainty. Not certainty of victory, but certainty of something far more unsettling. That everything they had been told, everything they had believed, was wrong. Completely, irreversibly wrong. As they stood there, under the electric glow of a Texas night, watched by curious civilians who had come to see the arrival of enemy soldiers, they were no longer just prisoners of war. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a reality that could not be explained away, could not be dismissed as propaganda, could not be ignored. And as they were led toward the camps that would house them, not in chains, not in misery, but in conditions that would challenge every assumption they still clung to, a new phase of their journey began. Not one of survival, but of confrontation. Because what awaited them inside those camps was not just captivity. It was exposure to a system, to a society, to a way of life that would force them to ask a question far more dangerous than any they had faced on the battlefield. If this is the enemy, then what does that make us? And inside the wooden barracks of Camp Hardened, Texas, with electric lights overhead, running water at their disposal, and meals that rivaled those of their own officers, that question would begin to echo louder. Day after day, meal after meal, observation after observation, until it could no longer be silenced, until it demanded an answer, one that would not come easily, one that would take months, even years, to fully understand, and for some, a lifetime to accept. The answer did not arrive as a sudden realization. It crept in quietly. At first it appeared in small moments, details so ordinary they might have gone unnoticed under different circumstances. The barracks at Camp Hardened were made of wood, simple structures, nothing elaborate. And yet to the men who entered them, they felt almost excessive. Each building was equipped with electric lighting. Not dim, rationed bulbs, but steady illumination that could be switched on at will. There were proper beds raised off the ground, with mattresses that did not sag into the frame. Blankets were clean, sheets were changed, and then there were the showers. Hot water, on demand. For many of the prisoners, this alone felt like an impossible luxury. Months in the desert had reduced hygiene to a privilege. Even before that, in Europe, conditions had rarely allowed for such consistency. Here, it was routine, expected, standard. The toilets flushed, the sinks ran continuously. Water, clean, abundant, flowing, was simply there. Unretizia Vera Burkhardt, the same soldier who had written of electric lights in Mexia, now found himself staring at a faucet, watching water run over his hands longer than necessary, not because he needed it, but because he could. It was a strange kind of disbelief. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. And it was spreading. The camp hospital delivered another shock. German medical personnel among the prisoners were granted access, sometimes even allowed to assist. What they found inside unsettled them in ways that were difficult to articulate. Equipment, modern, well-maintained, plentiful. X-ray machines that functioned reliably. Surgical tools that were not worn down from overuse. Pharmaceutical supplies that, in Germany, had become scarce or entirely unavailable. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a senior medical officer, walked through the facility in silence, absorbing detail after detail. But one discovery stood above all others. Penicillin. The drug had been rumored in Germany, spoken of almost like a myth. A miracle treatment capable of stopping infections that would otherwise prove fatal. And here, in a prisoner of war camp, it was being used, freely, not reserved for high-ranking officers, not restricted to critical cases, but administered even for relatively minor conditions. German soldiers, he knew, were dying for lack of basic sulfur drugs. And yet here, their enemies treated them with something far more advanced. It was not just a question of resources, it was a question of priorities. And that question cut deeper than any material comparison, because it forced a confrontation with something far more uncomfortable. What kind of system invests this level of care into its enemies? The kitchen offered no relief from these thoughts. If anything, it intensified them. Prisoners assigned to food preparation entered a world that felt almost industrial in its scale. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, massive gas ranges, automated dishwashing systems. Meals were not cooked. They were produced, in quantities that defied their expectations. Milk, fresh and plentiful. Eggs, vegetables, white bread, always available. Meat, regularly served, and always more than necessary. Regulations required that meals be prepared with a surplus, an additional 10%, to ensure that no prisoner went without. The result was inevitable. Food was thrown away. Perfectly edible food. Not because it had spoiled, not because it was contaminated, but because there was simply too much. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a trained chef before the war, stood over a bin as he discarded bread one afternoon. His hands hesitated. For a moment, he could not let go. Because in that piece of bread, he saw something else. His family, ration cards, empty shelves, hunger. And then, slowly, he released it, watching it fall. That moment stayed with him, not because of the act itself, but because of what it represented. The difference between two worlds, one defined by scarcity, the other by excess, and the realization that those worlds were not equal. They were not even close. By the end of the summer of 1943, the prisoners were no longer simply observing. They were comparing, constantly. Everything they saw in the camp was measured against what they had known before. And increasingly, those comparisons led to uncomfortable conclusions. The Americans were not improvising. They were not stretching limited resources to maintain appearances. This was not an illusion. It was infrastructure. A system built over time, scaled, refined, and now fully mobilized. The next phase of that realization began when the prisoners were sent outside the camp. Labor shortages in American agriculture had reached a critical point. With millions of American men serving overseas, the need for workers had become urgent. The solution was both practical and transformative. Prisoners of war. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, they could be employed in non-combat labor, farming, processing, support industries. And so, groups of German soldiers, men who had once advanced across deserts and battlefields, were loaded onto trucks and driven into the American countryside. No blindfolds, no attempts to conceal their surroundings. They were allowed to see everything. And what they saw would accelerate the collapse of their worldview beyond anything the camps alone could achieve. In Texas, at a cotton gin outside Houston, Unretizia Herbert Lang stood beside a machine that seemed almost alive. It roared with motion, belts turning, gears shifting, fibers separating. In 1 hour, it processed more cotton than his entire village could have handled in a month. He tried to follow its operation, to understand it, but it moved too quickly, too efficiently. And when he looked beyond the machine, he saw something even more striking. The farmer who owned it, a man of no particular status, no aristocratic background, no political rank, and yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, a tractor. Everything that, in Germany, would have been reserved for the elite. And his workers, they ate well. Even the black laborers whom Nazi ideology had taught them to view as inferior, possessed food and living conditions that exceeded those of many German citizens. Lang wrote later that this detail disturbed him more than any other, because it did not just challenge economic assumptions. It challenged the entire racial hierarchy he had been taught to believe in. And it did so not through argument, but through evidence. In Nebraska, the lessons continued. Prisoners worked in sugar beet fields where mechanization had transformed agriculture into something almost unrecognizable. Combine harvesters moved across the land with slow, unstoppable precision, each machine replacing the labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men. The fields stretched endlessly, flat, open, productive. Farmers spoke casually about yields that, in Germany, would have been considered extraordinary. 60 bushels per acre, numbers that seemed exaggerated, impossible. And yet, the harvests were there, visible, tangible, real. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann worked on one such farm near Scottsbluff. One afternoon, he watched a 16-year-old boy climb into the seat of a tractor. The machine itself was massive, powerful, new. Hoffmann asked about it. The boy shrugged, said it wasn't even the best model. His father was waiting for a newer one, a better one, from a company called John Deere. Hoffmann said nothing, because he had no frame of reference for that statement, no way to process it. In Germany, a machine of that value would have represented a lifetime of work. Here, it was replaceable. And in that realization, something shifted again, not just about America, but about Germany, because if this level of productivity was possible, if this efficiency, this abundance, this scale could exist, then why didn't it exist at home? Why had they been told that scarcity was strength, that sacrifice was virtue, that hardship was necessary? Why had they believed it? The questions multiplied. And with each passing day, the answers they had once accepted began to feel less convincing, less stable, less real. By early 1944, the prisoners who worked near industrial centers began to experience the final and most decisive phase of their transformation. They were taken to factories, not to produce weapons directly, but to support the industries that made production possible. And there, they witnessed something that would erase any remaining doubt. At a food processing plant in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines that operated with astonishing efficiency. Conveyor belts moved continuously. Machines filled, sealed, and labeled cans at speeds that blurred the eye. Workers monitored systems rather than performing manual labor. One elderly woman controlled an entire section of the line, alone, while listening to a radio, drinking coffee. The scale of output was staggering. What would have required dozens of workers in Germany was handled here by automation, by design, by engineering, and the product, food, again, always food, always abundant, always moving. Elsewhere, near Detroit, prisoners assigned to coal unloading saw the shadow of something even larger. Across the water stood the River Rouge complex, a vast industrial organism. Steel entered one end, finished products emerged from the other, vehicles, engines, machinery, everything produced in a continuous flow. The plant consumed electricity on a scale that dwarfed entire cities, and surrounding it, parking lots, filled with cars, thousands of them, owned by workers, not officials, not elites, workers. The idea settled in slowly, then all at once. This was not just a wealthy nation, this was a system designed to generate wealth, relentlessly, efficiently, at a scale that could not be matched. And if that system was now focused on war, then the outcome was no longer in doubt. By the time winter passed into spring, something remarkable had occurred inside the camps. The arguments had stopped. The debates about victory had faded. The loud voices, the most fanatical believers, had grown quiet, not because they had been forced into silence, but because they had run out of explanations. Reality had replaced ideology. Observation had replaced belief. And the result was not rebellion, but introspection. Men who had once marched under banners of certainty now found themselves asking questions they had never considered before. Not about tactics, not about strategy, but about truth. And in that quiet shift, in that internal confrontation, the real transformation began. Not imposed, not demanded, but chosen. One realization at a time. The transformation did not announce itself. There were no declarations, no sudden renunciations shouted across barracks. It unfolded in silence, in the quiet hours after lights out, in conversations that began cautiously, then deepened, in the way men who once spoke with absolute certainty now paused, reconsidered, questioned. By early 1944, American intelligence officers monitoring the camps began to notice something unusual. Requests. Prisoners were asking for newspapers, books, educational materials. At first, it was a trickle. Then it became a current and finally a flood. Men who had spent years absorbing only a single, rigid narrative now sought out alternatives. They wanted to read, to compare, to understand. American authorities, prepared for this moment, responded not with restrictions, but with access. Libraries were expanded, courses were introduced, English classes filled quickly, history lectures drew crowds. Even correspondence courses from universities began circulating through the camps. What had started as captivity was becoming something else entirely. A classroom, a laboratory of ideas, a place where belief itself was being dismantled and rebuilt. One prisoner, Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was weak, divided, incapable of unity. Yet everything we see contradicts this. This is not chaos. It is order of a kind we do not understand." That phrase, "we do not understand," appeared again and again in diaries, letters, and testimonies. Because what these men were witnessing was not just wealth. It was a system, a structure of production, distribution, and governance that functioned with a consistency they had never experienced. And more importantly, it functioned without fear. That realization reached its most profound moment during the winter of 1943. Christmas. For many of the prisoners, the holiday had become a distant memory, something tied to a world that now felt impossibly far away. In Germany, celebrations had grown smaller each year of the war. Rations reduced, supplies scarce, families strained under loss and uncertainty. But inside the camps, something unexpected happened. Packages began to arrive, not from the military, not from official channels, but from civilians. Hundreds of thousands of them. Church groups, civic organizations, families. Each package, addressed not to an individual, but to an enemy. Inside were small items, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, handwritten cards, simple gestures. But their meaning was immense, because these were not acts of obligation. They were acts of choice, acts of generosity extended across the divide of war. At Camp Herne, a local church choir performed Christmas carols in German. The prisoners stood in silence as familiar melodies filled the air, carried by voices that belonged to the very people they had been taught to despise. Some did not sing, some could not, but many listened. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not in ideology, but in perception. Because this was not weakness, it was not decadence, it was confidence. The kind of confidence that did not require hatred to sustain itself. The Christmas meal itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, vegetables, pies, ice cream, food in quantities that overwhelmed even the most disciplined among them. They ate until they could not continue. Not out of greed, but out of disbelief. Because somewhere, deep inside, they were still trying to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been told, and the two no longer aligned. By 1944, the educational programs within the camps had expanded dramatically. Thousands of prisoners enrolled. They studied language, economics, science, political theory. They debated. They argued. But the nature of those arguments had changed. No longer centered on victory or defeat, but on the future, on what would come after, on what Germany could become. The camp newspapers, written by prisoners themselves, began to reflect this shift. Articles discussing democratic systems appeared alongside reflections on economic policy and reconstruction. For many, it was the first time they had encountered such ideas without censorship, without fear, without consequence. And that freedom to think, to question, to explore proved more powerful than any directive. It allowed them to reach conclusions on their own. And those conclusions were often uncomfortable, because they led to a realization that went beyond military defeat. A realization that struck at the core of identity itself, that they had been wrong, not just about the enemy, but about themselves. That realization became unavoidable in June 1944, when news reached the camps, the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. At first it was numbers, 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, hundreds of thousands of men. The scale alone was staggering. But it was not just the scale, it was the execution. Within days, prisoners were shown newsreels. They saw it, the beaches, the endless lines of landing craft, the artificial harbors, the supply chains already in motion. 15,000 tons of material delivered daily, across open water, under fire. It was not chaos, it was coordination, perfected, relentless, unstoppable. For many prisoners, this was the moment the final barrier collapsed. Because everything they had witnessed in America, the factories, the farms, the infrastructure, was now being translated into action, into war, and it was overwhelming, not just in force, but in certainty. One prisoner, Oberst Friedrich von Tobin, later wrote, "We knew then that it was over, not just the war, but the idea behind it. We had challenged a system we did not understand." And perhaps that was the most important realization of all, that the conflict had never been equal, not truly, because one side was built on ideology, the other on production, on capacity, on a foundation that extended far beyond the battlefield. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the final revelation arrived. April 1945. Footage from liberated concentration camps was shown to German prisoners. At first, many refused to believe it. They called it propaganda, fabrication, exaggeration. But the evidence was overwhelming. Images, testimony, confirmation from multiple sources, even letters from Germany. The truth could no longer be denied. And when it settled in, it shattered something deeper than any previous revelation. Because this was not about strength or weakness. This was about morality, about the nature of the cause they had served, the system they had supported, the reality they had accepted without question. Headman Walter Schmidt captured it with painful clarity. "We thought we were fighting for civilization. We discovered we had abandoned it." That realization carried weight, a different kind of defeat, not physical, but moral. And it changed everything. Because now the transformation was complete, not just in understanding the enemy, but in understanding themselves. When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners did not return home immediately. There were months still to pass, months spent preparing, learning, rebuilding internally before returning externally. American authorities introduced vocational training agricultural education, political instruction, not imposed, but offered and increasingly accepted. Because by now the resistance was gone, replaced by something else. Curiosity, determination, even hope. They were not being prepared for punishment. They were being prepared for reconstruction. And that, perhaps more than anything else, defined the final stage of their transformation. Because it revealed intent, not to destroy, but to rebuild. When the prisoners finally returned to Germany between 1945 and 1946, they did so as different men. They stepped into a country that was shattered, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure broken, economy collapsed. But they carried something with them. Memory, not of defeat, but of possibility. They had seen a functioning system, they had experienced its results, and now they understood what was required to rebuild. Many would go on to play roles, small and large, in that reconstruction. Applying lessons learned not in classrooms alone, but through observation, through experience, through transformation. And in the decades that followed, as West Germany rose from ruin into one of the world's most powerful economies, those lessons would echo, quietly, persistently, embedded in policies, in practices, in the very structure of the new society. Because the men who had once stepped off trains as prisoners had returned as witnesses to something greater than victory. The story of German prisoners of war in America is not a story of captivity. It is a story of confrontation. Not between armies, but between belief and reality. These men arrived in 1943 carrying certainty. Certainty in their nation, in their ideology, in their understanding of the world. And one by one, that certainty was dismantled, not through force, not through coercion, but through exposure to abundance, to efficiency, to a system that worked. They saw factories that produced without limit, farms that fed entire populations, cities that functioned without fear, and people who treated enemies, not with hatred, but with dignity. And in that contrast, something profound occurred. Because the most powerful argument against what they believed was not spoken, it was lived. Every electric light, every full meal, every act of unexpected kindness became evidence. Evidence that could not be dismissed, could not be ignored, and ultimately could not be denied. This was the true power of what President Franklin D. Roosevelt once called the arsenal of democracy. Not just the ability to produce weapons in unmatched quantities, but the ability to demonstrate a way of life that made those weapons almost secondary. Because in the end, the war was not won solely on the battlefield. It was won in factories, in fields, and, perhaps most quietly, in prison camps, where enemy soldiers witnessed something they had never been meant to see. A system stronger than propaganda, stronger than ideology, stronger even than fear. They came expecting to confirm their beliefs. Instead, they lost them. And in that loss, they gained something far more powerful: understanding. The Germany that emerged after the war did not rise from victory. It rose from realization, from the recognition that strength did not come from conquest, but from creation. Not from domination, but from cooperation. And that lesson, learned in the most unexpected of places, would shape the future of Europe for generations. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more deep cinematic explorations of history. Because sometimes the most important battles are not fought with weapons, but with truth. And sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that change minds.